All right, we can go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for the FDP's template webinar. I'm Lillian Andrews, your host for today, and I want to go over a few logistical notes before we get started. If you have any technical issues during today's meeting, please contact Zoom technical support at 1-888-799-9666 and select option 2. The audio for today's webinar will be streamed through your computer speakers or through the call-in feature, depending on which you selected. Please submit questions you have through the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Today's webinar is being recorded. That recording, the meeting slides, will be posted on our website after the meeting. And I'm now happy to turn things over to Amanda Humphrey.
Welcome to the 2020 Subaward template overview. Today we will outline an overview of the templates as well as updates to the templates and the data use attachment. So let's start with introductions. I'm Amanda Humphrey from Northeastern University and one of the co-chairs of the FDP Subaward Subcommittee. I will be moderating today's session. I'm fortunate to introduce our panelists for today. The template overview will be led by my fellow co-chairs, Amanda Haymaker from Purdue University, Kevin Ritchie from Harvard Medical School. The template and guidance updates will be led by Stephanie Stone from Mass General Brigham, Laura Register from Stanford University, Kathy Harlan from Nova Southeastern University, and Julie Renkes from the College of Charleston. The Human Subjects Data Use Attachment 7 overview will be led by Martha Davis from Brandeis University, Melissa Korf from Harvard Medical School, and I'll be jumping in there as well. Please feel free to ask questions along the way through the Q&A box. We will pause to address questions at the end of each section. This webinar is divided into 3 sections that will be recorded and cut into shorter training videos, which will be linked from the fdp.org. Finally, any questions we cannot cover today, we will respond to via email. Next slide, please. So here's just a little quick agenda for each of the 30 minutes. This is what we'll be covering in each of the sessions. Since we'll see this again later, we'll just move on. Next slide, please. And next slide, please. I've addressed most of this. Sorry. All right, so now we'll get started. Welcome to the 2020 Subaward Templates Overview. Today our presenters are Amanda Haymaker from Purdue University, myself, Amanda Humphrey from Northeastern University, and Kevin Ritchie from Harvard Medical School. I'll hand things over to Kevin to get us started.
Hi, everyone. Kevin Ritchie, and like Amanda said, I work at Harvard Medical School where I manage the outgoing subaward process. And I also serve with Amanda Humphrey and Haymaker as co-chairs of the Subaward Subcommittee. But my perspective is still limited on this, so feel free, if you're familiar with the templates or subawards in general, we'd love to hear what you have to say via chat. Any questions or comments, more than welcome. I'm going to explain what the FDP Subaward template is, give you some very brief demonstrations about some of the built-in functionality that is programmed into the document itself, and talk a little bit about the process behind using the FDP Subaward templates. This particular section doesn't have too many slides, but don't worry about that. Everything that we're talking about, the documents and the resources, are on the FDP website anyway, so you don't really need other slides for that. You'll have the links to find all the documentation that you need after the presentation. Okay, so around FDP, you're going to hear a lot about cooperation, not just cooperation between universities and federal agencies, but cooperation between universities themselves. And you're going to hear a lot about reducing administrative burden. And so it was in the spirit of cooperating between universities and reducing administrative burden that the FDP developed these subaward templates that have been very widely adapted by the membership thus far. And so if you're a new FDP member, I just want to encourage you to keep cooperation and reducing administrative burden in mind as you adopt these new templates. They're designed to make things easier, and they're designed to streamline the subaward process between universities. So maybe the most important thing that I can say up front is that the templates are not meant to be edited. It's not meant, they're not meant to be changed, or that the terms and conditions in the subaward template are kind of there. Take them or leave them. If you want to edit the FDP template, you have to remove the FDP moniker and all the labeling from it. And essentially you're operating off of your own template at that point. But by having the FDP moniker and using the FDP template, there's some built-in trust and reliability there that a lot of universities who use these templates rely on. The terms and conditions that are in the subaward templates are the result of extensive conversation and negotiation, careful analysis of evolving federal regulations. They're constantly iterated and updated. And again, they've worked well for countless subawards between FDP institutions. So this is a really good product. And a quick note on the terminology. We use template a lot, and most of the documents published are PDF form templates. However, there are some Word documents that you'll find that we call samples. And those are a separate type of document that are meant to be edited, meant to be more tailor-made to specific institutions or specific awards. But I'm not going to get into those details quite during this presentation. And I'm going to stick to the basic use case of the FDP subaward template. Despite the fact that we don't negotiate the terms and conditions in these templates, and despite the fact that we've achieved a lot of uniformity by using the FDP subaward template, there's still so many scenarios out there. There's so many possible collaborations and situations that you could find yourself in. So these templates come with a lot of supporting documentation, frequently asked questions, and other tools to help you use them. And that's fine. And my colleagues are going to go into some of those tools and resources that are available. So like I said, we can't cover every single possible scenario in this presentation. This is just a simple basic introduction. And so what I'm going to do is use the cost reimbursement subaward template as a base case. Once you get familiar with this template, all the other templates and modifications and amendments will look familiar to you. This is sort of just the most generic version that we have. And despite the webinar, any other exposure you get to the template, you have to read the whole thing one time to fully understand what's in there. So I would encourage taking a little bit of time and reading through the template so that you understand what is in there, what isn't in there, and where you have some flexibility when you draft these subawards. And before I ask Lillian to pull the PDF up on the screen, you access it through the FDP website, that this or any of the other templates. Please download it and save it to a local drive or your desktop before using it. Don't work on it in a web browser. This is just a basic tip because you'll lose some of the built-in program functionality if you operate it out of your web browser. So you just want to save a local copy and operate off of the PDF form itself. So Lillian, if I could please get the PDF document and the ability to control the screen. Okay, so what we have here, the FDP template is a face page plus a series of attachments, between 6 or 7 attachments, depending on what your award looks like. The face page contains some pretty straightforward prime award information, subaward information, and institutional information. What you're seeing now on your screen is for the most part self-explanatory. However, if you go through the template and you have a question about something, there's a lot of built-in, you see these question boxes that will maybe kind of guide you as to what data needs to go into these boxes. Okay. As we scroll down here, you'll see the built-in terms and conditions, the ones that I just told you not to edit. I want to point out to just 2 in particular to give you an example of what I'm talking about. There's invoicing frequency here. Subrecipients shall submit invoices not more often than monthly and not less frequently than quarterly for allowable costs incurred. Okay, that's a lot. That's the standard, sort of the industry standard that we've established over a long period of time. Now, if you attended the last FDP meeting, this came up. So we're discussing it, we're looking at it. But as of right now, if you use the FDP template, that is the standard for invoicing frequency, and we don't change that. Same thing with the 60-day deadline for final statements of cumulative costs incurred. That is 60 days, and if it's built-in PDF text, you're not meant to change it. Now, if it's in a drop box, a drop down menu, excuse me, then you're free to provide different contact information. There's some flexibility built in throughout the whole Subaward template. But if it's PDF text, not meant to be edited. Okay, I'm going to continue to scroll off of the face page. You'll notice at the very bottom of the face page is where the authorized officials sign the document itself. And once both parties sign, it's fully executed, file it away, and move on with the project. Attachment 1. Attachment 1 is just one-page certifications and assurances. A lot of the information that you would see in a SAM.gov registration or in an FDP expanded clearinghouse profile. There's no functionality on this page. There are no options on this page. So really, when I review an incoming subaward, I scan right over attachment 1 because there's built-in standard terms that have to do with complying with certain federal regulations that we call out in the subaward. So I'm going to just scroll right through to the next attachment. Attachment 2, which is the federal award terms and conditions. This is where we're starting to get a little bit more specific than the face page. The face page terms sort of apply broadly to a lot of federal awards, whereas now we're getting into agency specific terms and conditions or award specific terms and conditions. But there's a shortcut here for you. I'm going to go back up to the top, and this should be the first thing that you do when you download the template, is you should select who your federal awarding agency is. We'll go with NIH. You should click Run Template. And what that's going to do is it's going to populate a lot of attachment 2 that we were just looking at. So as I scroll back down to attachment 2, and actually while I'm here, I can show you if you want to designate a subaward number that will also populate throughout the document. So let's try and scroll down to, okay, so see the attachment, the subaward number that I randomly generated now appears on every page. And if you come down to the general terms and conditions, you'll see that the NIH links are provided. If you selected a different agency, the agency appropriate links would appear. You know, it's good to double check, but again, we've programmed a lot of functionality that just helps you get to where you need to go. And then along with attachment 2, attachment 6, if you attach the prime award, you're almost there. You've almost flowed down all the federal terms and conditions to your subrecipient. So a lot of that work is done for you. Okay. I want to provide, let's see. So there's some drop-down menus here, again, where there's some flexibility on how you want to determine, you know, copyright licenses and whatnot. But I just want to show you some of the interesting functionality that that people have built into this template. When it comes to human subjects, for example, you can just select human subjects, and then you can kind of tailor the IRB situation. You can ask for IRB documentation from your subrecipient upon request. You can require it prior to executing the agreement, or you can say why IRB documentation is not required. Say there's a single IRB designated. Okay, go back here, no human subjects involved, boom, it's empty. So there's that built-in functionality where you kind of just have to check boxes as to what applies to your project, and the subaward template will help you out. Same thing with human subjects data. If it's not applicable, the section is blank. If it's applicable, you get to select which direction the data is going, and you get to choose whether to use a separate data use agreement or attachment 7, which you're going to hear about a little bit later in the presentation. The last comment I have about attachment 2 is this additional terms box here, which you'll notice is a free text box. This is to incorporate any other additional federal award requirements or any other additional laws. It's not meant to be a free-for-all. It's not meant to add all institutional preferences or anything like that. And if you hover over this question box here, it says additional terms as required by the federal award or to cover human subjects data, or additional terms as may be required by a risk assessment. Anything that goes in this box must be well justified and ideally tied directly to the federal award itself. An interesting example, a lot of state institutions, I've seen a lot of state universities add some state laws here that is required of them, no problem. That's a law that as a state university they have to adhere to. This would be the place where you enter the additional terms. But again, only what is actually required, and we really want to avoid institutional preference here. Attachment 3 contains the pass-through entity contact information and the subrecipient contact information. I'm not really going to talk too much about it here. Some of this information is used for FAFATA reporting requirements, but it's really just basic contact information. It's self-explanatory. You'll notice there's drop-down menus throughout the subaward which tell you who your point of contact is for various issues or various questions. That those drop-down menus tie directly to what you enter into the attachment 3 component of the subaward. Just a couple more pages and a couple more minutes here as I scroll through. Just want to expose you, introduce you to the whole document. So we're going to move on to attachment 4. Again, you'll notice the subaward number has populated throughout. So on every page, the subaward number appears. This is just the non-financial reporting requirements, and you can just check which ones apply. Monthly technical progress reports that you want within 15 days of the end of the month. It's easy enough. And if it doesn't apply, then just uncheck the box. You can also discuss prior approval, whether it's automatic or requires whether carryover is automatic or requires prior approval in this section. And just like I showed you on human subjects, there's some functionality. Ideally, only the federal awarding agency should be restricting carry forward, but there are some institutions, it's in the single-digit percentage, but there are some that as a pass-through entity would restrict carry forward in this case. And just like I mentioned for attachment 2 additional terms, there's another free text box here for additional technical reporting requirements. This is not to add burdensome requirements, but this is an opportunity to maybe call out some specific reporting requirements that are buried in a long prime award. If there are extra requirements that the prime sponsor or that the federal awarding agency is requiring, you can call them out here. But this text box should be used in a way to help your subrecipient, make them clearly aware of what the requirements are rather than impose more burdensome technical and reporting requirements upon them. All right, about another minute or two here. Attachment 5, statement of work and budget. It's very simple. You can either type out the statement of work, copy and paste the statement of work here, or you can attach pages. Say you have a lot of milestones, you can attach all 5 pages of extensive milestones and very detailed scientific statement of work, or you can keep it simple and restrict it to the text box below. Same thing with the budget. There's some indirect cost considerations here, but you could also just include a simplified budget below, or say you have a 5-year award and on the initial subaward, you want to attach all 5 budget years so that you can make the amendments easier in the future. You can attach them here. You just insert those pages right into the PDF document as you compile the draft and send it to your subrecipient. The last page before I turn this over to Amanda Haymaker to go over some of the resources that help guide the use of the FDP Subaward template is the federal notice of award. So whether you attach it or don't attach it, anytime there's a radio button, anytime there's a drop-down menu, you are given the flexibility as the pass-through entity. But just like when the carry forward restriction that I mentioned, a very small percent of institutions do not incorporate the federal notice of award. And I would strongly suggest and say that it's best practice to attach the prime award, because you're essentially flowing down the prime award to your subrecipient. That's what you're doing as the pass-through entity. And redact it if you must. I've seen redacted prime awards. Maybe there's some subrecipient funding information that you don't want other subrecipients to be aware of. That's fine. But best practice is to attach the federal notice of award. So that is the walkthrough of the base case cost reimbursement template. And I want to leave Amanda some time to go over the resources here. So questions, comments in the text box, and we'll see what we can get to. I will, Lillian, if you could bring up the website, and Amanda Haymaker is going to take over from here.
Hi, everyone. We're going to move over now to the Subaward Forms web page on the FDP website, and you can see right at the top of the browser there is a link. It'll take you straight to this page. This is where you're going to find all of the templates and samples and all of the related guidance documents. So quickly, I'll just scroll through here and point out a few key things. So Kevin just introduced you to the cost reimbursable template, and that is found right here. And then you'll find a number of other attachments and samples and agreement types that you can use. We scroll down. The next section is guidance, and this is something you want to become very familiar with. We have an FAQ and template guidance document out on the website. I'm going to open it up and just familiarize you all with this document. It is currently out for comment for the next version. If you're on the listserv, you probably saw that email come through yesterday. So please take a look and provide feedback to the working group that develops this and maintains it. This document has 85 questions, and I'm going to give a huge shout out to that working group. They have labored over this for years on a very regular basis, making sure that all these resources are available for all of you and all of us to use in working on these agreements. The first section of this document is really good to familiarize anybody who's new to the agreements with the different sections, what they're used for. A lot of the things that Kevin just talked about are spelled out here, so you have it in a document form to reference back to. And then after that first section, actually, before I move too far, I will point out there's a disclaimer in here highlighted in yellow on purpose to make sure you see it, that this document does not constitute legal advice. So this is just our interpretations from the working group, and should be used to help with making sure that federal policies mentioned and uniform guidance are followed and complied with. So once you get through this first section that kind of goes through the different attachments and what they're for, and then there's some other definitions about the foreign subaward sample. There's some general information. It starts to get into a whole bunch of questions that are broken down by category, and you can navigate through if you're looking for a specific answer by going straight to that category section that it might be in, or searching for keyword, that sort of thing, to try to find some guidance. And just to point out a few things, so we have general questions. There's some FAQs related to modifications. There's FAQs as we get much further down related to invoicing, like Kevin mentioned, that there's some questions around invoicing. So current guidance is in this document. There are even details about backup documentation related to invoicing and our recommendations there from an FAQ standpoint. It's a little slow to scroll, so yeah, here we go. So just a lot of different topics covered. There's sections specific to the UG elements in the FDP Subawards, and making sure that we're meeting our requirements as dictated by the uniform guidance. And then, of course, the hot topic questions related to period of performance and how to fill out those different boxes, which are part of the updates, I believe, in the new FAQs. In addition to that, there's just some basic compliance related questions when it comes to those sorts of topics, and some discussion related to cost reimbursable versus fixed amount agreements. And basically 85 questions covers a lot of topics and can get you a long way in maybe answering some of your initial questions, or even some of your more detailed questions when you first or when you encounter them throughout working with the subawards. Lastly, I want to point out the end of this document. There are about 8 pages devoted to carryover guidance. So I strongly recommend referencing that if you have questions related to carryover. And I know many of my co-chairs would say don't do carryover unless you have to. So I don't personally do subawards, so I don't have to deal with that myself, but I know they feel very strongly about it. So just make sure you're looking through these questions and getting some guidance on how to be, you know, a best or a good steward, I guess, with the FDP mission and trying to reduce administrative burden. All of these questions are written in a way to, or with that in mind, and to help everybody try to stay kind of on the same page and operating in the same way. So if we go back to the website, let's see, how do I do? I didn't practice that part. Let me go back. Yes, okay. So back on the website, there's a few other tools I want to point out in the last couple of seconds here. We have a number of different things in the guidance section. There's a guidance crosswalk that talks about changes from one version to the next. And so that has also been drafted for the new version that is coming out here soon. There's a number of different tools here in this this section. The key things that I want to point out, there's a modifications user guide. So if you have to do a modification or an amendment, there's a user guide that talks through using those templates. And then we have a subaward guidance chart here. Let me see if I can open that. That helps you to think through which type of agreement fits your different situations. So there are some good details and kind of a crosswalk here to help you think through that process when trying to determine what's the best agreement type to use in your situation. And then there's a major changes document here that we release every time there's a new version of the templates put out. And this will highlight any of the changes that were made so that you can easily identify where something is different versus the prior version of the template. And then the last thing is the Subaward template field crosswalk. That's another good resource to help identify what kind of information goes in the different fields. It's primarily targeted for people who populate their templates through some sort of an internal system, but it's also a great resource for others. And with that, I think I'm going to turn it back over and see if there's any time to answer a couple of questions.
We do have a couple of questions, and luckily we've had a few of our other panel experts answering questions as well during the session. So I've got a couple of ones marked for you guys though. Someone asked about adding Department of Energy as one of the Fed agencies in the drop-down menu. And I just want to quickly respond to this. Unfortunately, the Department of Energy is not actually an FDP member. They're not one of the 8 federal agencies that is partnered with the Federal Demonstration Partnership. And so you just would select the other box for Department of Energy. Can these templates be used for subcontracts under the FAR? Kevin, would you like to take that one?
No, you'd have to use you'd have to use the subcontract sample that we have on the website that Amanda Haymaker was just showing you. But there are certain types of research arrangements that you can't use the cost reimbursement template that I just walked through for. You would have to search the website for, you know, if it's fixed price, there's a different document for that. If it's foreign, there's a different document for that. If it involves clinical trials, there's a different document for that. So you'd have to explore the website that Amanda was just walking through to see what templates and samples are out there for you to use. And they're posted with a description of how they are best used on that website.
Awesome, thank you. One of the users has asked, what's the main function of the run template? So the reason that we have the run template button is as we were customizing and developing out some of the functionality that auto-populates various things and makes the templates a little bit easier to use. The code needed to be, the easiest way to run it was to do this run template function on there. Laura can give a much better, more eloquent answer about that, but that's kind of the quick answer that I can give at a high level.
When you do click the run template though, it'll populate. You can then change those fields if you need to, those ones that have populated for any reason. And if you print to PDF, that button will disappear on your final fully executed document.
Perfect, thank you. Another attendee has asked if AHRQ could be brought into the FDP, and what about other federal agencies? We have certainly had those conversations at FDP about who is participating, which federal agencies. That's up to the federal agencies, and so we'll kind of keep working on that, but that's definitely a great thing that we'll bring up. All right, so someone asked about in future iterations of the template, could you add a free text box to attachment 6 where we could list the attachments included, including notice of award, data management plan, multi-leadership PI plan, resource sharing plan. That's definitely something that I can copy and paste this after the session. We have a running list of any recommendations. So Teresa will definitely make sure we add that to the running list of recommendations or suggestions we get from people. We maintain that list throughout the year. And then when we review the templates annually, we take those comments and we review and assess them in addition to assessing any regulations. So there's a number of answered questions that are available in the chat, and we will try and save the chat after this and post that along with the webinar so people can get the full benefit of the responses that our panelists were able to provide in the chat. One quick one, somebody asked about adding export control related terms and conditions to attachment 2. There's actually a really great FAQ about that in the guidance document that Amanda Haymaker walked us through. So I would definitely recommend taking a quick look at that. In the interest of time, we are going to move forward, and I want to thank Kevin and Amanda for doing a fantastic job walking us through our resources. And now we're going to move on to the next part of our agenda. Next slide, please. Looking at the 2020 updates to the guidance document and templates. This section will be led by Kathy Harlan from Nova Southeastern University, Laura Register from Stanford University, Julie Renkes from the College of Charlestown, and Stephanie Stone from Mass General Brigham. Next slide, please. And this is kind of geared toward new and existing members at all experience levels. And basically what we'll be doing today is walking through the changes made for the 2020 templates. And similar to our last session, we will utilize the cost reimbursement template as an exemplar for demonstration, but changes are pretty consistent across the formats. And I'm now going to hand this off to Stephanie Stone to walk you through.
Great, thank you. Next slide, please. So essentially what we try to do is not change the templates too much. We all know it's administratively burdensome to constantly be trying to operationalize new templates. However, the federal government likes to make changes that we then must flow down into the subawards. So we did have to make some changes this year to make sure that the subawards are consistent with the new uniform guidance regulations that were released in November. But for the most part, the changes that we're making to the new templates are really to just address UG. We're trying not to overhaul anything. We have a great template formats going, and we've addressed a lot of things over the years. So really trying to focus on UG. The modifications, however, were pretty overhauled, the amendment templates, at the suggestion of Laura Register, who is already doing excellent work at Stanford with the modifications, and we basically stole Stanford's templates, which is awesome. Thank you, Laura. And again, as Amanda was saying, we really are focusing on the cost reimbursable template since that's our main bread and butter template, if you will, but there are many other templates and samples in the FDP arsenal. And we did go through and update everything that does have a UG reference to make sure it was accurate in all of the documents. Next slide, please. So this is a listing of all the templates that were revised, all of our lovely cost reimbursable, fixed amount, the two types of bilateral amendments, the one unilateral amendment, and there's also samples that were amended as well. Those are more, let's say, flexible templates that can be modified a lot more easily. They're in usually a Word version, and it's designed to be more flexible because you're likely going to use those in more unique situations, perhaps with higher risk entities, versus the templates are that more fixed PDF version that really shouldn't be edited, only minimally. Next slide, please. So one major thing we were trying to grapple with, and someone was asking a question about this in the previous Q&A, was around period of performance and budget period and terminology, and we were just going over and over it. In UG put out in a new definition section 200.201 that period of performance per UG is the total estimated time interval between the start of an initial federal award and the planned end date, which may include one or more funded portions or budget periods. So essentially what we're trying to do in the subaward is mirror UG and kind of mirror what the federal government is thinking when they're giving us as a PTE a direct award. So in the subaward, we have this concept of you have budget periods where we're authorizing funding for certain periods of time with the expectation that there's also in the background an estimated period of performance. Perhaps most of our subawards would go 5 years, maybe not a full 5 years, but generally speaking, we're thinking about, your estimated period of performance being several years versus your budget period being this 1 year, perhaps less than an official year based on your federal award or based on the start date of the sub. So in the brand new cost reimbursable template, we've removed that period of performance terminology that really, we replace it with budget period. So when you're filling in the new template, your first budget period is under subaward budget period. Next slide, please. And then below that, there is a new field that we're calling estimated period of performance, not estimated project period, because we're trying to go with the UG mirroring. So we have this field for you to then put in what you estimate will be the end date of the subaward. The start date would be the same as your initial budget period, but then the end date would be perhaps several years into the future, depending on how long you think the subaward will go, coinciding with your federal award end date. Next slide, please. So these changes that we're talking about right now are on the face page, so that the first page, has so much in it, it's so valuable. And we try to, put everything that is extremely relevant right there on the first page so that the minute you see it, you have a lot of identifying information. But there, and in UG, the federal government did kind of change some of the citations. So we went through and made sure that the citation that references the subrecipient subaward definition is changed to the proper citation now, the 200.331. I see someone was talking about the subrecipient subaward distinction, and we are trying to be careful to make sure that we're following the UG guidelines and labeling a subaward when it truly is a subaward versus a contract or subcontract. The final invoice due date selection. So you have 2 selections to choose from in the template on that first page about when you're going to want a final invoice. Do you want it every year at the end of each budget period? Or do you want it just one at the very end of the subaward at the last day of that estimated period of performance? So we worked on the terminology there to mirror what we were talking about previously with budget period and period of performance. So essentially that final budget period end date means really the very last end of the subaward, which is that estimated period of performance end. So you never know exactly when will the final end date be. There may be several renewals, several no-cost extensions, might be terminated early. But the idea of that, the first bullet distinction is to say, I just want one invoice at the very end that wraps everything up, versus the each budget period end date. Would you be saying as a PT, I need my subrecipient to do essentially an annual final accounting of what they've spent. Next slide, please. So also on the face page, we were trying to pull in some of the high points from UG, some of the big things that changed. Not everything. We didn't want to go overboard with it. You know, we only have so much real estate, if you will, on the template. We don't want to be making massive changes. We don't want to be adding in a bunch of things. The idea, at least with the cost reimbursable template, is that you're issuing it to other FDP entities who are pretty well versed in the federal regulations. So we try not to go overboard with flowing things down, with the expectation that our other FDP members know the federal regulations very well. If you put in brief notes and citations to things, they understand what those are and will already have read the full regulation in other contexts. So a termination, and this had come up in prior years, that our current termination language is essentially that either party can terminate for any reason within 30 days notice. And some people had brought this up in prior years to say, what if the federal agency terminates your award and you get less time than the 30 days notice? So that also became more resonant this year when UG really put some more guidelines out there for the federal agencies to be able to terminate with more flexibility. So we just wanted to make sure that was noted, and that the PT may be required to terminate the subaward in accordance with the awarding agency requirements, which might differ from that standard 30-day notice. Next slide, please. So face page, that was everything that we changed in the face page. Hopefully is very minimal, not too much work for everyone. We don't want you to have to do a massive overhaul to get the new template operationalized. In attachment 1, we looked at the audit language, and we did realize there were some citations that were off since the new UG, and just tried to make the text a little more clear. But there really isn't any sort of real substantive change to it other than clarity and making sure the citations are accurate. Next slide. So the other big thing we did in attachment 1, and as Kevin was saying, attachment 1 is our fixed attachment. You cannot change it. It is there. It's always there. It's fixed text. There are no boxes to fill in, nothing. So you have to accept it for what it is. And what we try to do in that attachment 1 is to only put in these extremely relevant, very high button issues that the federal government wants to make sure that as a PTE, you're telling your subrecipient. These are very important federal rules that we want you to make sure your subrecipient knows exist, that you can't just rely on attaching the notice of award and having them read through all the guidelines. So we hit the really big points in attachment 1, and one new regulation from the new UG that we thought would be extremely relevant to include is that new 2 CFR 200.216 prohibition on purchasing telecommunication and video surveillance services or equipment. We, again, don't have a ton of room in the template, didn't want to make attachment 1 more than 1 page. So we squeezed a brief note about this new regulation into that attachment, just to make sure that both parties are fully aware that this applies to all of the federal grant and cooperative funding, applies to both PTs and sub-recipients. Next slide, please. So in attachment 2, we really tried to be as brief as possible. Again, not making very slight changes. One of the other UG definition terminology changes that the federal government decided on was to change everything that was CFDA, the Code of Federal Domestic Assistance, now to assistance listing number or assistance listing program title. So the references to those numbers and titles was changed. And we also updated some of the links to the Federal Awarding Agency General Terms and Conditions. Some of the Fed agencies updated their policies. So we just made sure that the most recent Federal Awarding Agency policies are included. If those are those federal agencies that are included in the drop down on the first page as being FDP federal agencies, still the other agencies, this page comes up blank and you need to fill in the appropriate federal flow down policy. Next slide, please. So so that was it for the new template. I swear, see, it wasn't that much, right? It was very minimal. We tried to be as minimal as possible. We know we're all super busy. You don't want to be dealing with this brand new template that looks so different and you have to explain it to your staff. And we do have a crosswalk on the website that goes through each change that will hopefully help explain it to your team. So with the modifications, there were some updates that we made for UG purposes and some that were really more about the overall format of the modification. The modification had been updated in a while and Laura had some excellent ideas from her time at Stanford. So we said, let's do an overhaul now that we're doing this UG change. Laura, would you like to go through some of these changes?
Sure, we absolutely can. So cumulative budget periods was chosen because under the new UG regulations, they have the specification of budget period, which is what has been obligated, and then they have period of performance, which now includes estimated periods. When we got to the amendment portion of the agreement, we wanted to make sure that there wasn't any confusion about what those dates encompass. So the cumulative budget periods was chosen so that every budget period that has actually been committed will be accounted for here. So your start date will be the original start date of the agreement, and your end date will be whatever your revised end date is, or if you're doing something else with this template, whatever your prior end date is. So whatever it is that you have committed to the subrecipient. So that we're hoping will make it as clear as possible that budget period is really what you have already provided to the subrecipient or are providing as part of this modification. We removed the effective date because we found that it was being used inconsistently, and in most cases, most people did not find it to be a valuable date because the date of signature is typically the date of full execution, or within the agreement itself, it would state the dates at which it was applicable. And so adding effective date was a little bit repetitive and quite frankly, rather confusing. So that was removed from the templates. Next slide. So contact email box, before this just said email. Again, it was a little bit confusing as to whose email was supposed to be in there. Is it the PI's? So we added the contact email. So this is really who you're sending this amendment back and forth to within each organization to make sure that you're getting it countersigned or that it's appropriately negotiated. UEI, we might be jumping the gun a little bit with this because it was originally supposed to roll out this winter before COVID occurred. Now it has been pushed back to April of 2022. And so we are leaving this in here because it is still going to be rolled out at some point. So basically, if you obtain a UEI and you have not already provided it on a prior agreement, this is where you would put it in. This is not a requirement to put it in on every single amendment. It's to provide it to the PTE to ensure that they then have it for their records if they don't already when it goes into effect. So for the time being until April of 2022, whenever they roll it out, you don't need to worry about this field. But when it does happen, please provide it to the PTE as they send these out if you haven't already done so. Next slide. So this, there is a modification template that just has a text box for you to write in anything if you need to. There's also the unilateral. So for those of you that don't know, there are 3 modification templates. There is one that is pre-filled with options that will auto-populate and generate based on what you've selected. There's one with a blank text field so you can enter in whatever you need to. And then there's the unilateral, which is not meant to be countersigned and is for a very limited use case scenario. And so what we're demoing today is the preset modification here. And that's because it's going to have checkboxes for you to select anything that's applicable. So if you're not adding an additional budget period, you leave it blank. If you're not adding a no cost extension, you leave it blank. But if you are, then you can select it and it will pre-populate the terms associated with your selection. And then you can put the date that's appropriate for those areas. Next slide. Okay, so there is some programming in here. We tried to leave this as flexible as possible because we realize that each organization does things a little bit differently, but we also wanted to ensure a level of consistency. If there are two boxes that are always going to be exactly the same, we made sure that they populated. This is an example of that. If you're adding an additional budget period, so you're extending the end date on the subaward, or if you're doing a no cost extension to extend the end date on the subaward, it's going to automatically populate the end date up at the top of your cumulative budget period, just so that we know, so that there's no discrepancies in between there and so that there's no confusion. By and large, we try not to do that too much to box anybody in, but in this case, those numbers should always be the same and therefore they're programmed, saves you some energy. So if you type it in the top, it'll populate it into that field. If you type it in the field, it'll populate it to the top either way. Next slide. So if you're issuing a renewal where you're adding time and money, you're going to go in, you're going to add the additional budget period, which is usually, your 1 year increment that you've received on your NOA or whatever it is that you're providing to the subrecipient, and then whatever additional funding that you're obligating to the subrecipient. So again, only check the boxes that are applicable to the changes that you're making on this subaward agreement. Next slide. So deobligation is a new option, and we kind of went back and forth because we know not everybody does deobligate, but it seems like there was a substantial amount of organizations that did. And so we wanted to give this option where if you are perhaps you have a carryover restricted subaward and you want to deobligate funding from a prior period while also adding additional funding for a current period, this can help clarify those scenarios. Or if you just need to contractually reduce the funding on the subaward itself, then you would just select deobligation. But this allows you now to do an amalgamation of different contractual changes while making them clear and so that they don't overlap with one another. So you're going to put the amount that you're reducing from the funding and then the period that you're reducing it from. So you can say if it's from a current period or a prior period or anything along those lines. Next slide. So modification template. So the carryover label up top on the old amendments just had the option for yes or no, or automatic or not automatic. This now has an option for it to be left blank. We did have some questions around if you have a fixed price and carryover is not applicable, you can just leave this area blank. So if you are altering the carryover situation, if you're going from automatic to not automatic, that will require a bilateral amendment. So you cannot change the carryover situation using the unilateral amendment. So just be aware of that. It does have the option so you can make it clear basically what the carryover situation is on the unilateral template. But if you're actually changing it for the subrecipient, that will require a bilateral. They will need to countersign on that sort of change. Next slide. Actually, if we could go back to the prior one, it doesn't look like we have a screenshot of it, but there is now the option. You'll see that checkbox that's under there, and it's actually carryover, a carryover has changed box. So if you are changing the carryover, you're going to select that box and you're going to put, or if you're authorizing carryover, you are going to select that box and you're going to put how much you're authorizing in carryover and the period that you're authorizing it from. So just make sure that if you are authorizing, let's say carryover is restricted, but you got an authorization from NOA or from NIH and their NOA to go ahead and provide it to the subrecipient. This is where you would authorize this to the sub, is that checkbox. So those two things are independent of each other. Whether it's automatic or not, it can still stay not automatic. You're maybe not opening it up for the subrecipient, but for a specific period, you are going to authorize carryover. This is where you would do it. And again, you want to specify the amount and where you're authorizing it from so that the subrecipient and the PT can appropriately account for it.
Laura, we have about 5 minutes left.
Okay.
So we,
I'll talk
Or do you want to
fast.
go to the questions?
we have a lot of questions,
Okay.
but we also have Kathy and Julie have to go too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So next slide real quick, I'll just go through these. So now you have options for attachments where you can say what attachments you have. This is also a free-form field, so it gives you some selections you can choose, but you can also type in there if you have something specific that you want to say. So this way it makes it clear that you're actually incorporating these attachments as part of this agreement, and it's not just they're sort of slapped on the end and not really sure if they're part of the agreement or not. Next slide. Okay. So do we want to go to Kathy and answer questions afterwards, or how would you like us to go forward with that?
Let's go with
Okay.
Kathy and Julie.
That works for us.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. I'm Julie Rankus from the College of Charleston, and together with Kathy Harlan of Nova Southeastern University, we co-lead the guidance document working group. Lily, can you go to the website? Thank you. So the guidance doc group is primarily responsible for maintaining the FAQs. That was the big guidance document that Amanda Haymaker was going over earlier. We also maintain the guidance crosswalk, which is the document directly under the FAQ document. And that basically just describes the changes from the previous version of the FAQs to the current version so that you can go back and see what's been changed, what's been added, etc. And the other document that we just started being in charge of actually is the very bottom document under the tools box, the modification user guide. So this user guide was developed to really walk through each field of the modification templates and explain what each one is for. So those are the three documents that we primarily maintain. The way that it works is the guidance doc group gets together once a year, once the templates have been updated, and we go through the FAQs and determine what needs to be updated or changed, especially if something changed in the uniform guidance. We had a lot of changes this year because of the uniform guidance changes. We just want to make sure that the information in that document continues to be accurate. We recently completed that, and we distributed the draft version 8 to the Subaward listserv for review and feedback. So once that's finalized, that version, along with the guidance crosswalk for it, will be posted to the website. So I think that previous presenters have gone through these tools pretty well. My advice to you is to remember the 2 rules of FDP Subawards. The first rule is don't change the templates. The second rule is check the FAQs because there is a lot of information in there. And if you have a question about, the budget start date, etc., all of that is addressed in the FAQs. And if you don't find your answer there, or if you're still unsure, then reach out. Kathy, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Julie. In the interest of time, I think we've really covered a lot of the basics. I'm just going to add a couple things with respect to the crosswalk. I think it was Stephanie that mentioned earlier the crosswalk as it relates to changes in the subaward template. So I don't want people to be confused with this crosswalk. That crosswalk is under the tools. This relates specifically to the guidance and is just designed to show people what's changed between the old and the new FAQ. I think the document is pretty self-explanatory, except to say that this time around, we didn't add any new FAQs. So you'll see the numbering remains consistent between last time and this time around. If it says no change, it means there was absolutely no change. If it says no change, but we removed revised or new from the guidance doc, it just means nothing changed, but we did just make that one minor change to remove the word. And then we'll note what the revision was or what the new question was, if a new question was added in the crosswalk. And this time there was no new question. And we had the majority of the changes, as you'll see if you peruse that document, relate just to updating references. There are a few more substantive changes, but I'm reluctant to go into that right now, Amanda, because I know we're on a time crunch and we've got some questions. So I think I'll just close it out by saying If there's any questions about the guidance or comments, email Julie or I, or you can send it directly to your co-chairs and they'll make sure it gets down to us appropriately. So, and thanks to everybody on the guidance doc work group. It was a lot of people putting a lot of effort into it, and it's an evolving document. So if you have questions that need to be added, well, just let us know. We'll address it. Thank you.
Absolutely. And I think, Kathy, that's such a great point to bring up that we do have a general mailbox set up that goes to all three of the subaward co-chair subawards at the FDP.org. And so if you're ever not sure, which co-chair was I thinking of, or which working group, just send a note to us and we'll try and connect you with the right person and make sure that any of our working groups get the information that they need. So we're going to just do like 2 or 3 questions really quickly before we move on to the last section. So this is a really good question. And I think, Laura, this is one that you'll be able to answer for us. Does anyone have a problem with Adobe Sign failing to recognize that the institution type drop-down field has been completed? An error results, and thus we have to print, scan, and insert 3B into the final PDF.
I have not run into that issue. I'd probably have to see what it looks like. First thing I'd say is make sure that you're downloading. That's the big thing that we see a lot. You can't actually run it from the web browser. You do have to download the template. If you're seeing something along those lines, maybe I can do a Zoom and troubleshoot with you what exactly is going on, because I have not seen that scenario. Another thing maybe is if you have a very old version of Adobe and you're not running something that's updated like DC, you may run into some configuration issues between the 2 iterations.
Great. On the updated versions of the amendment templates, why have the fields been removed for the IDC rate and the breakdown of direct and indirect costs?
This was more of an administrative burden sort of scenario. That field that only existed on the unilateral modifications. It didn't exist on the bilateral modifications. And so the removal of it was made just to reduce the administrative burden, because it wasn't something that was actually required. If you'd like to, you can still add it in a comment section of it if you would like to include that breakdown as well. We just didn't keep fields for it.
Great. Do you recommend attaching material transfer agreement terms, or MTAs, to the FDP agreements? And I'll just quickly answer that. We do not. We actually did have a dialogue about this about 1.5 years, 2 years ago. And we decided that adding that would kind of make things a little bit clunky, because a lot of times the material transfer agreements end up in a different office than the office that's processing the subaward, more so than perhaps the data use agreement, which we're going to talk about next. There's another question about a crosswalk. Is there a crosswalk that will show what fields are updated when you pick the sponsor on the cover page and then run the template? If it is URL information for the sponsor, can we rely instead on the URLs in the NOA that we will include with attachment 6? So we do actually show all of that information in the field crosswalk that was on the Subaward forms page. It's in the tools section, and it says, we call a lot of things crosswalk, but it says like the field crosswalk, and that will show you both the auto population feature as well as what links auto populate in various places. And it's up to you. You can go in after you run the template and manually blank out those forms, or say see attachment 6. But we do check all of the links before or when we post the template. So they should be good to go if you want to rely on those. If anyone has anything else. All right, and we have some thank yous for great work on the updated documents. And we are now, in the interest of time, going to say thank you to Stephanie, Laura, Julie, and Kathy. Great session. And we're now going to move on to our next session. Next slide, please. Welcome to the 2020 Subaward Templates Attachment 7 review. This will be led by Martha Davis from Brandeis University, myself, Amanda Humphrey from Northeastern University, Melissa Korf from Harvard Medical School, and Stephanie Stone from Mass General Brigham. Next slide, please. So really quickly today, we are going to walk through a session that is intended for new and existing members at all experience levels. And we are going to walk through attachment 7, which is a human subjects data attachment, including an overview of how to use it, tools, and then we have a use case example that we will also run through. Next slide, please. And I'm going to hand this over to Martha to pick up.
Thank you, Amanda. Can you hear me? Okay. So attachment 7, which is still in the pilot stage, has been available for about 4 months. And to get a sense of how it's going and how much folks are using it, we have added a poll question. So please select one of these answers that pertains most to the status of attachment 7 at your institution. You have started using it and your PIs find it helpful. You would like to use it more, but your PIs are unsure about it, or you'd like to learn more about attachment 7 before using it. Now, is there a place? Because I'm not actually seeing the place for the poll.
The poll has already been launched. Panelists cannot vote, but the attendees are already voting.
Okay, great, thanks.
Yeah, 41% right now. So let me know when we want to stop the voting and we can launch the results.
You can probably, I see it pop up in a box, Martha. So if you want to move on with the next part, we can leave it open for a minute or two and then close it and look at it in a second.
Okay, so on to the next slide, or is that what you're thinking, Amanda? Okay. So hopefully people have been using it. We'll find out. By adding attachment 7, it reduces administrative burden, which is in keeping with FDP's mission. And what is attachment 7 and what is it used for? Well, attachment 7 provides standard language for the FDP institutions to utilize when incorporating human subjects data transfer and use terms, that's a mouthful, into the FDP Subaward templates. It allows the PTEs to choose an option of having human subjects data transfer and use terms be part of the FDP Subaward template, instead of issuing a subaward and then setting forth the terms of exchanging the human subjects data in a separate DTUA. So it's like trying to bring it in all at once. And how is it designed? Well, the FDP Subaward working group, along with the DTUA working group, they got together to see if it would be possible to do this. What they realized, in order to do it, the human subjects data transfer and use terms language needed to be incorporated into the subawards, and the agreement needed to define the type of human subjects data exchanged, the legal requirements attached to that data, and how the exchanged data may be accessed or used. So attachment 7 turned out to be the perfect solution because it could be a little less than a full DTUA, because the subaward agreement already has language in it that is also part of a standalone DTUA. And some of that language that is already incorporated into the subaward agreement is the liability language, publication language, and use of name and termination. And so we didn't want to add that again to attachment 7 since it's already in there. And what we were able to do is to make attachment 7 successfully describe the flow of the data, the identity of the data type, the legal requirements, and other applicable terms. Should we try going back to the poll? Close it.
You read my mind. I was literally just typing to Lily, why don't you just go ahead and close it?
So, wow, a lot of people aren't using it yet, which makes sense because they maybe haven't been aware of it. It's good to see that 22% have started using it and that their PIs find it helpful. Now, the PIs being unsure, I'm hoping that in this training, we'll be able to provide you with some reasons why it would be so helpful for the PIs to do this at the subaward stage as opposed to having a separate DTUA. And great, so we're going to impart information to you about this so you'll be able to start using it. So next slide. So, okay, great. So why is attachment a 7 a good idea? Let's see, let me get to my notes. So by combining the two agreements, it will prevent confusion. It helps with negotiation, and it is very clear to both parties what the expectations are, and it has everything in one place, so it helps with record keeping. And there are no conflicting obligations within multiple agreements. So that's what has been helpful as on our end at Brandeis, we found that. And it also it enables at the start of the project for all the parties to be aware of and agree to the data transfer upfront and to avoid project delays because a DTUA hasn't been negotiated yet. It also ensures that the relevant IRBs are aware of and have approved, if applicable, the specifics of the exchange prior to the execution of the subaward and subsequent authorization of work to start. So looping in the IRB at the start of when the subaward's being issued is better for everybody. Next slide, please. So how do you know if you should use attachment 7? So Amanda will be discussing shortly some use case examples in the thinking process that goes into knowing when attachment 7 should be used. But this slide is a quick checklist to use to know whether adding attachment 7 to the subaward is appropriate. First, ascertain if the project has human subjects data, and if so, what type of data and who is providing it. Then review the transfer and use terms based upon the data type and other requirements that may pertain. Once the parameters of the transfer of the human subjects data is known, then take a look at attachment 7 to see if it is appropriate. And Amanda will discuss this in more detail. The point of attachment 7 is it serves to describe the data to be transferred, the flow of the data, and the terms and conditions specific to the data being transferred in the subaward. Next slide, please. So if we could go to attachment 2, that would be great. And Kevin already showed you part of this process, but I just want to do it again so people know how to use attachment 7. Oops. So all of this will be filled out as part of the subaward. Let's see.
There's a second page to attachment 2, Lily. It's on the second page of attachment 2.
So I guess I don't have control of this. If you could go down to the human subjects part of attachment 2, that would be great.
Martha, I gave you control.
Hmm.
That's your mouse. You just have to double click.
Yeah, I'm doing that. I don't know, it doesn't seem to be working. Oh, I guess there's just a delay, big delay. Okay, so here we are at the top of attachment 2, and you scroll down to the human subjects section, and you would check human subjects and do whatever applicable here. And also you would here click the flow of the data. And if it's just going from the subrecipient to the PTAT PTE, you would click there, or PTE to subrecipient, or both if it's going both ways. And then you would, with this drop-down menu, click in attachment 7. And once you do that, let's see if I can, it will, so part of my screen's covered, but anyway, so then we would go to attachment 7. So you would open attachment 7. I think what I need to do is do a different view, I'm sorry. Okay. And again, you would do the same thing here. You would click whatever the flow of the data is. And again, as Kevin mentioned, be sure to download this before you start filling it out and save it to your desktop. Don't do it from the web. And I have a couple of notes here. So you will be selecting the data type. If you have questions about this, the FDP tool for classifying human subjects data can be used to determine which data type is being shared. The tool can be found on the FDP Data Stewardship website. Then once you click, so let's just click PHI and click to the side, and then you will see that the applicable terms will auto-populate on page 2. And it will auto-populate all the applicable for each one. If the data is other, let's say it has more stringent security measures that you have to add, then it will not auto-populate specific terms. It'll just have a text box, and this is free text here and free text here in this box. You should enter, for step 5, you should enter a description of the data in the text box. You can refer to the protocol or the scope of work, and or you can reference the statement of work in attachment 5, but this will define what the data is that's being transferred. And if it's other, then you would fill in the other terms that relate to that specific data. There is a user guide that has been created that is also on the FDP Subaward Forums website that goes through all of these steps. So if we can go back to the slides, be great. And so we can go past this. We just talked about it, and we talked about this one, and we talked about this, and we talked about this. All right, so now let's. So there are times when it would not be appropriate to have attachment 7 with a subaward. And how do you know? So if it's data that is perhaps governed by a third-party agreement, then it wouldn't be appropriate. If the recipient needs to use the data beyond the subaward SOW, then you would want to do a standalone DTUA. And if there are multiple types of data, multiple parties involved, then a separate DTUA or another separate agreement would be more appropriate. Okay, then actually, then I think it gets turned over to Amanda.
Okay, I'm up. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about thinking about how you identify if you think you might have human subjects data in the first place. This has been a really tricky area for institutions to build into their processes, and I've been in a number of different institutions, and this has just been something that people are really building their awareness of. And so it does take time and looking at a lot of different scopes of work or different subawards and scenarios, I think to kind of build that. So it will take a little bit more time up front, but hopefully in the long run, it will pay off. So I always think about preparing a subaward a little bit like a mise en place, like prep work. So I try and like lay everything out that I think I'm going to need to prepare the subaward beforehand. And I think really like taking time to look at things beforehand seems like it will take more time at first, but it kind of speeds up the process because you're able to put all your questions together for the faculty member and send them off in one bucket. And I think that's really important when you're starting to parse through some of the questions that you may have specific to human subjects data, when to recognize it, how to ask about it, and just working through those issues with your faculty member. I think that frames it for them when they're getting all the questions about the subaward at once. It just really helps them to work through it with you. Next slide, please. So I, in particular, look through all of those documents that I've collated to try and look for any mismatches. For instance, I've had situations where I get a subaward request and the department has filled out in their subaward request form that there is no human subjects data being exchanged in the subaward, and yet the scope of work says, and then the subrecipient is going to send human subjects data to the pass-through entity that I'm at as I'm drafting. And that happens, you know, it's really about flagging that inconsistency and following up on it. It's not that someone is trying to do a bad job or trying to make a mistake. It's just something that people are busy and not everyone is trained throughout all the levels of your organization to recognize human subjects data. So it's going to be awareness building, not just for your central office, but also for your department. And some of that starts with just remembering to reconcile and align those documents and go back and ask those questions. Now, it could turn out that this data is de-identified and therefore the PI doesn't consider it to be human subjects data. However, understanding that is kind of helpful because you may still want to identify that de-identified human subjects data is being exchanged and propose your preferred language. We do have an option on attachment 7 for de-identified human subjects data. And if there's a key to the de-identified data or any other way of reconciling it, you may still need to identify that as human subjects data and put the appropriate language in place. And I think, one of the other things to bring up is if the subrecipient notices the mismatch between, oh, I thought I was sending human subjects data and they're saying I'm not, it will cause a delay in issuing the sub because you're going to have to sort through all of those different questions. And a couple of people have asked about, I really like using attachment 7. If you don't put it on there, maybe they're going to propose a separate DTUA or propose a different process. So if you really want to try and encourage adoption of attachment 7, I think having that already there and an easy solution really helps to speed up the process. So if you if there's like a PI that maybe isn't responsive because they're out of the country or they're unavailable at the moment, I sometimes, before I send out the subaward, will reach out to that subrecipient contact that has been identified and just quickly ask them, I'm seeing some different information here. Can you just help me work through this? And that's also a helpful way to move through it if going to your department isn't going to work for you at that moment in time. Next slide, please. So this is a fake statement of work that I made up, and I'll run through it really quickly because we only have a few minutes left and there are some really fantastic questions in the chat. So Dr. K will collaborate with Drs. X and J on evaluating longitudinal data on the correlation between diet and exercise. Dr. K has 25 years experience with researching the interplay between diet and exercise and has published all these papers. Dr. K will provide critical resources on design of the project and protocol. Dr. K will provide data from an existing cohort. Dr. K will also work with Drs. X and J on the analysis of the data and co-author all manuscripts. So I have a lot of questions just based on looking at this without even looking at any other pieces of information. You know, I think it will take going back to your proposal or progress reports and seeing what does the main proposal include anything about human subjects being utilized in this? Are you know, is it something where you're actively enrolling subjects or otherwise identified that human subjects are involved? I often will kind of think through, okay, so what does the budget look like? Is there an IRB protocol somewhere in this file? You know, and use that to help me frame my next steps. Next slide, please. So if we're looking at this just through the scope of work, here's a little bit of additional context. You know, you're adding the subaward midstream. So hopefully you have some information in the progress reports, or you have a lot of information that can support either that human subjects are not being used, which can help you narrow down, okay, so it's not active human subjects research that I'm working with, but maybe there's, you know, they talk about data from a cohort. Is that something that was an existing data set that already existed, and help you really focus those questions so you're asking good focused questions. And so next slide, please. I would just offer that human subjects data is still in a process where we're figuring out how to identify accurately throughout all the different lines at our institutions. So I recommend that usually people kind of train themselves to look for keywords. If they see references to coding data and someone having a key, that's usually a good sign, if they're bothering to code the data, that data is potentially related to human subjects, that they're trying to de-identify or de-associate the actual human subjects record, like the direct record, with the data that they're providing to and from another institution. Sometimes I also look at data that, you know, what is it that they're doing their work on? Is it health and social research? Is it economics? That can kind of help inform you a little bit in terms of, you know, if they're doing research on art, what is the likelihood that they're really going to be doing human subjects research or if they're doing chemistry, where, you know, what do I think is most likely? And again, that can help you frame your question, point your question. Next slide, please. So just based on this really quick overview, what do you guys think? Do you think that, yes, this is definitely human subjects research and it needs to have a data use agreement of some kind, or attachment 7? This could be human subjects research, but I'm not really sure. Or I would have to call the PI and or department admin for more information. No way, no human subjects or their data here. We'll give you guys a minute to respond to that. And we'll quickly move on to the next slide, please. And we'll start opening up and answering questions. So really quickly, this is just a resource slide, understanding data types. Melissa and Martha have done a fantastic job in helping to collect a lot of stuff under the data stewardship working group of the FDP, or committee of the FDP. And so these are some of the resources they've come up with: a tool for classifying human subjects data and a data use agreement guidance chart. So the first question that we have is, what term should we select, budget period or project period, end date on attachment 7? Does this term get selected based on whether or not there is auto carry forward or not? So usually when I look at this question, I look at it to match what's on the face page. So if you've selected budget period or project period on the face page, line up attachment 7 to that face page. Martha, is that what you would do?
Actually, sometimes the data needs to be used for the whole project.
Okay, yeah.
So it depends.
So it will be like more of a case by case, you might have to ask some questions to figure out, are you going to use this for the whole of the anticipated project, or is this something where you're going to cycle it over each time?
Right.
Absolutely. Okay, great. Is attachment 7 necessary for the fixed rate clinical research subaward? Regarding the fixed rate clinical research subaward, why isn't attachment 2B attached as a PDF already? Martha, I'll let you answer the question about attachment 7, and then I can answer the question about attachment 2B, or Melissa.
Yeah, I think Melissa should take it.
I was going to say, I could chime in on that one. Oh, okay. My video got frozen for a second there. I think you can hear me. So it really depends on the specific situation, right? So if you're one site of a multi-site trial, then it may be highly likely that the data coordinating center is doing a separate multi-part data use agreement between all of the sites, in which case that's what you want to rely on rather than attaching attachment 7. If you're just one site and there is data that needs to go between the PT and the subrecipient for a clinical research subaward, then it would be certainly appropriate, if the circumstances allow, to utilize attachment 7.
Awesome. And the question about why isn't attachment 2B attached as a PDF already, that is the one section of this whole clinical research subaward that is negotiable, because it with clinical trials, there can be variation that it just differs project to project. And so we kind of needed to have that, since attachment 2B contains the terms that are most frequently negotiated between the institutions in a clinical trial. It ended up working out that that was the easier way to deal with attachment 2B, so institutions could redline it and send it back and forth, and it could be more easily tailored to that particular situation. Since the clinical research fixed rate clinical research subaward is a sample and not a template, the way that the cost reimbursement template is a more fixed template, there is more latitude there for changes as well. So we did, Lily is just going to close our poll for us, and I will read another question that we got, and then we'll look at the poll, and I think we may have to sign off after that. But someone asked, I'm trying to use attachment 7, but other institutions have told me they are not using attachment 7 or insist on a separate DTUA, which makes it difficult for me. How do we get everyone to use it?
Does Melissa want to take that one too?
So, I mean, I think that we have to be kind with some of our colleague institutions on this. In that, one of the other questions was, well, what if it's a tech transfer office that is responsible for DUAs and then subawards go through a very different office? It can be very tricky to resolve some of those workflow issues when you have two separate offices that are responsible for reviewing. So, as many benefits as use of attachment 7 offers us, there are a number of our colleague institutions whose workflows just don't support that yet. So the best way is to talk about your wonderful experiences and maybe how you've resolved some of the issues. And I think that sort of relates to one of the other questions that we received about additional opportunities to share our experiences and how we worked through the challenges of obtaining the required information, sharing our experiences about how we worked through some of those workflow challenges. And I think those continued conversations are really going to be what spurs adoption of attachment 7.
Absolutely. So attachment 7 is in a pilot phase right now. And we're hoping to continue to develop adoption of it by doing things like this webinar. So next slide, please. And we're just going to show you, these are some of the tools that we mentioned earlier. This is the tool for classifying human subjects data. Next slide, please. This is the guidance chart that helps you understand when you have to have a DTUA, when you may need a DTUA, or when you may not need a standalone DTUA. And I think a lot of these rules can be applied to whether or not you need to cover human subjects data in attachment 7, or in some use cases through a separate DTUA, like when you're using human subjects data from Europe, you would definitely not want to use attachment 7 for that. You would want a separate standalone DTUA. Next slide, please. And so this is just a really quick list that I want to highlight as a great resource that Martha put together for us all. Of information and resources that can help support your data use agreement endeavors. So thank you everyone for participating. We really appreciate it. Thank you to Martha and Melissa for helping us work through all of this. The poll results for our case study is most people did agree. Not sure, I would have to call the PI and or department administration for more information. And I think that's absolutely the best course when you see a scope of work like that. So thank you everyone. Have a great day. And thank you so much for joining our webinar today.